The ranch house looked abandoned from the road. The porch leaned. The barn wall had gaps you could throw a hat through. The south fence was down in 3 places, posts lying flat in the grass, like something had given up on them a long time ago. But the yard was swept clean. That was what made Everett Cole stop his horse. A man with 200,000 acres, 9,000 cattle, and more money than half the county did not usually stop for broken homesteads. He passed dozens of them every season, places drought or debt or grief had hollowed out, and he had learned to ride by them without much feeling, because feeling something for every collapsed roof in Wyoming would have ruined him for the work he actually had to do. But that swept yard told him one thing, plainly, the way only a small detail can. Someone was still fighting to stay. He sat his horse at the fence line for a long moment, just looking. A garden bed, narrow but tended, rose straight as a ruled line. A wash line with 2 shirts hanging, mended in a way that meant somebody had taken real time over the work and not just patched the holes shut. And that swept dirt yard in front of a house that should have, by every other sign, already been given up on months ago. Everett dismounted. He told himself he was only checking the creek crossing further down the property line, since water was the one thing he never left unwatched out here. Water being worth more than gold in this part of the territory, and most men too proud to admit how much they depended on somebody else's good behavior upstream. That was the reason he gave himself for walking toward that house. It was not the whole reason. He knew that, even as he told it to himself. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, and when the silence held, he pushed the door open the way you do when you've already decided the house in front of you matters more than the manners of waiting outside it. The front room was bare but not neglected. A cold fireplace, swept of ash, a small table with a lamp, the wick trimmed properly, and in a chair near the hearth, a woman asleep, boots still on her feet, a ledger open across her lap like she'd been working the numbers and lost the fight against exhaustion somewhere in the middle of a column. On the wall above her, hanging straight and deliberate, was a deed, framed plainly, the kind of frame a person builds themselves rather than buys, and positioned exactly where she would see it, first thing every single morning when she opened her eyes. Most men with Everett Cole's money, looking at a woman alone in a dying house with nothing left but a ledger and a deed, would have already started composing the offer in their head before she even woke. He did something nobody expected. But that part comes later. Before I tell you what he did for the woman everyone thought was finished, tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Her name was Clara Mercer. She was 36 years old, and 5 years earlier this homestead had belonged to her father, and before that, to nobody but the wind and the long grass, until he'd come out from Ohio with a wagon, and a wife, and more hope than sense, and built something here with his own hands that he was proud enough to die on, which he eventually did, 2 winters back. In the same week the drought finally broke the herd's back and forced her to sell what cattle hadn't already died standing in dry pasture. Her husband had gone before that, a fever that took him in a single bad season, the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself with drama, just arrives one morning and stays. So by the time her father followed him, Clara was alone on land that had already taken almost everything from her and had nothing left to give back except itself. She could have sold. People expected her to sell. The bank had sent 2 letters suggesting it gently, the way banks suggest things when they already know the answer they want. But every morning, Clara swept that yard, because a woman who keeps a clean yard in front of a falling house is telling the whole county something without saying a single word out loud. She is telling them she has not decided to lose yet. She woke when Everett's boot caught the edge of the floorboard near the door. A small sound, but enough. Her eyes opened and found him standing there, a stranger in her front room, and she did not scream. She set the ledger down without dropping it, the way a person moves who has trained themselves never to lose track of important papers in a moment of fear, and she looked at him with a steadiness that made him reconsider, immediately and without effort, whatever assumptions he'd carried in with him. "You're on private property," she said. Not a question, not a plea, a fact, stated the way you'd state the weather, except this particular fact had a deed hanging on the wall behind her to back it up. "I know," Everett said. "I should have called out from the yard. That's on me." He held his hat in his hands, the way a man does when he's trying to look like less of a threat than his presence naturally suggests. "Name's Everett Cole. I run cattle on the Triple Crown Range, west of here. I was checking the creek crossing and I noticed your fence line." "You noticed a lot of things, apparently," Clara said, glancing pointedly at the chair he'd found her asleep in, the boots still on her feet, the ledger now closed in her lap. "I noticed your yard was swept," Everett said. "That's the only thing that actually stopped me." Something passed across Clara's face, brief and unreadable, the look of a person who has spent a long time being looked at with pity and was bracing for it again, only to find this particular man wasn't offering any. "My south fence is my business," she said. "My barn roof is my business. And if you've come to make an offer on this land, Mr. Cole, you can save your breath. It wasn't for sale when I buried my husband. It wasn't for sale when I buried my father. It is not for sale now." "I haven't made an offer," Everett said. "I'm not here to." Clara studied him. "Then why are you here?" He looked around the room once, slow, taking in the swept hearth, the careful mend on the curtain edge, the deed on the wall, before answering. "Because your water runs into mine 3 miles downstream," he said. "And I've learned the hard way that whoever's upstream from you matters more than whoever's in the bank. I'd rather know my neighbor than guess at her." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly warm. It was, Clara would later admit, the most honest thing a wealthy man had ever said to her, and it was the reason she didn't ask him to leave. He came back 3 days later, this time calling out from the yard, like a man who'd learned his lesson the first time. He brought no offer to buy. Instead, he laid out something else entirely, and Clara listened with her arms folded and her rifle leaning, unloaded but visible, against the porch post beside her, because the world outside that fence line had not been gentle with her, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise in front of a stranger, rich or not. What Everett proposed was a lease, several seasons of winter grazing and water access on her south pasture, the part nearest the creek, in exchange for a fair market payment, a fence crew to repair what had fallen, and a new roof on the barn before the snow came hard. He would cover the cost of materials and labor. The land would stay hers, the deed would stay on her wall. Clara did not say yes immediately. She had seen, more than once in 5 years of watching this county chew through small homesteads, how generous men with money found their way onto land that wasn't theirs through favors that turned out to have very small print attached. She told him she wanted it written. Every term, a clear end date on the lease, not an open arrangement that could quietly become permanent without her agreement. A clause stating that if his cattle damaged her crossing or her crops, the cost came out of his pocket, not hers. And the creek bank itself protected. No overgrazing near the water that would erode what little soil she had left to work with. Everett agreed to every condition without argument, and something in the way he agreed, quickly, plainly, without trying to talk her down from a single demand, told Clara more about him than the offer itself had. "Most men," she said, "try to negotiate me down on at least one thing, just to prove they can." "I'm not trying to win anything off you, Mrs. Mercer," Everett said. "I'm trying to keep good water clean, and a good neighbor standing. Those aren't things I negotiate." The fence crew arrived the following week, 6 men and a foreman named Riggs, who had worked for Everett long enough to know how the man operated and long enough, also, to arrive at Clara Mercer's homestead with the quiet assumption that the woman who lived there would stay out of the way while real work got done. Clara did not stay out of the way. She was at the fence line before the crew had finished unloading their tools, pointing out where the post holes needed to be dug deeper because the ground there flooded every spring and shallow posts would heave loose by April. She walked the creek crossing with Riggs and showed him exactly where the bank had already started to erode, 2 feet further out than it looked from the road, because she'd been measuring it herself every month with a stake and a length of twine for the better part of a year. She corrected one of the younger hands when he started setting a post at the wrong angle, not unkindly, but firmly, the way a person corrects a mistake they have personally paid for in the past. By the 3rd day, Riggs stopped assuming and started asking. By the end of the first week, he was bringing his questions to her directly before he brought them to anyone else. Everett rode out to check the work himself near the end of that week, and what he saw stopped him at the gate for a moment before he went any further. Clara was standing at the creek crossing with Riggs and 2 of the hands, pointing at a stretch of bank, explaining something with her hands moving in the shape of water flow, and all 3 men were listening to her the way men listen when they've already learned, the hard way, that the person talking knows more than they do. That evening, before he rode back to the Triple Crown, Everett pulled Riggs aside. "She knows that land better than any of us," he said. "Listen when she speaks." Riggs nodded, already having arrived at the same conclusion days earlier, and didn't think much of the instruction beyond that. But Clara, walking past the barn with an armful of mended canvas, heard it through the open door, and she stood still for a moment longer than she needed to, because in 5 years of fighting to be taken seriously by men who looked at a widow alone on failing land and saw only a problem waiting to be solved for her, this was the first time someone with real power had simply decided, plainly, that she was the authority in the room. She didn't say anything about it to Everett, but that night, writing in her ledger by lamplight, the way she did every night, tracking feed costs and fence repairs and creek levels in the same careful hand her father had taught her, she added one more line at the bottom of the page that had nothing to do with money at all. She crossed it out a moment later, embarrassed at herself, but she'd written it, and some part of her knew it was true before she'd scratched through the ink. The correspondence between them started small and practical. Everett would send a short note with the crew, asking how the creek crossing was holding, whether the new fence posts were settling right. Clara would write back with specifics, exact measurements, exact concerns, nothing wasted. But the notes got longer without either of them deciding to make them longer. Everett started asking things that weren't strictly about the lease. Clara started answering them. It was the kind of courtship that doesn't announce itself as one. No flowers, no declarations, just 2 careful people slowly discovering that the other one read every word they sent with real attention, and there is a particular kind of intimacy in being read that closely by someone who has no obligation to bother. The trouble had been building before any of this started, though Clara had only half registered it at first, the way you register a storm building on the horizon days before it actually reaches you. His name was Barton Vale, and he had been moving through the county for the better part of a year with the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He represented a railroad survey, or claimed to, and he had quietly purchased 6 homesteads already, mostly from widows, mostly from families sitting on water rights they didn't fully understand the value of yet. He was unfailingly polite. He wore good coats and spoke in the soft, reasonable cadence of a man explaining an inevitability rather than making a threat, which was, in its way, more unsettling than a threat would have been. He had visited Clara twice before Everett ever rode past her fence line, both times when she was alone, both times leaving a card and a number that grew slightly larger each visit, framed as generosity rather than pressure. But once word traveled, as word does in small counties, that Everett Cole had signed a lease with the Mercer place, Barton Vale's visits changed in tone. He came a 3rd time on a Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand, smile easy, and sat his horse at her gate rather than dismounting, which Clara noticed and understood as its own kind of message. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I hear you've found yourself a generous neighbor." "I've found myself a fair one," Clara said. "There's a difference." "There is," Barton agreed pleasantly. "Fair men come and go, though. Leases end. Cattle barons get distracted by bigger concerns than 160 acres and a creek crossing." He let that sit a moment. "I'd hate for you to be standing alone again when that happens, with nothing left of this season's good fortune but a deed and a roof that needs replacing again in another 5 years. Is that a question, Mr. Vale, or a threat dressed up nicely?" "Just an observation," he said, smiling wider. "Though I will say, paper burns easily in a dry winter. Records get lost, fences get cut and blamed on drifters. These are things that happen out here. Mrs. Mercer, to people who stand alone on land, everyone agrees is valuable." He paused. "A deed is only as strong as the people willing to stand near it." Clara did not flinch, and she did not reach for the rifle leaning by the door, though her eyes flicked to it once, automatically, before returning to him. "I've buried a husband and a father on this land, Mr. Vale," she said. "I have stood alone on it, through drought and debt, and a county that wrote me off twice already. I think I know exactly how strong it has to be. Good day." She did not tell Everett right away, not out of pride, but because she wanted to be certain first that what she'd heard was what she thought it was, and not simply her own nerves reading menace into a careless man's manners. But 2 nights later, she found her water trough fouled with something that hadn't gotten there naturally, and a section of her newly repaired fence cut clean through in the dark, and she stopped weighing whether to say anything, and rode straight for the Triple Crown Range at first light. Everett did not arrive with a show of force. He came the next morning with 4 of his men, quiet and serious, and the first thing he did, upon reaching her gate, was ask Clara, directly, what she wanted to do. "I want him to hear it from me," Clara said. "Not from you standing in front of me like I need protecting from my own conversation." "Then that's how it'll happen," Everett said. Barton Vale arrived 2 days later, expecting, by every account Clara later gave, an empty homestead, ready to be frightened into an offer. He found instead Clara Mercer standing at her own gate, Everett Cole and 4 riders positioned a respectful distance behind her, present but not crowding her, the way you stand near someone you trust to speak for themselves. "Mrs. Mercer," Barton said, his smile thinner now, "I see you've gathered an audience." "I've gathered witnesses," Clara said. "There's a difference, the same as there's a difference between fair and generous, which you'll recall I already explained to you once." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "This land was not for sale when I was hungry. It is not for sale now that I have witnesses." Barton's eyes moved past her to Everett, looking for the easier target, the man with the money who could presumably be negotiated with on terms a woman couldn't enforce alone. "Mr. Cole," he said, "perhaps we could discuss this man to man. I'm sure we could find an arrangement that benefits." "I didn't come to buy her land," Everett said, before Barton could finish. "I came because I signed a lease that says her land matters. That's the only arrangement I'm here to discuss, and it isn't with you." Barton looked between them for a long moment, recalculating, the way men like him always do once they realize the easier path has quietly closed. He said something about misunderstandings, about never having intended any threat, the careful retreat of a man too smart to ever be caught having said anything provable. He rode away that afternoon and did not return. The story of that gate, as these things do in small counties, traveled faster and further than Barton Vale's reputation could survive intact. Within a month, 2 other homesteaders he'd been quietly pressuring sent letters to Clara, careful, grateful letters, asking how she'd managed to stand against him, asking whether the lease arrangement Everett had built might be something they could ask for too. Barton's quiet collection of frightened widows and desperate ranchers slowed considerably once it became known that at least one of them had stood at her own gate with witnesses and refused to be moved. But the real victory, the one that mattered most, wasn't Barton's retreat. It was that Clara Mercer was no longer standing alone, and everyone in the county now knew it, not because a wealthy man had rescued her, but because he had simply refused to let the world forget that her ground was hers to defend. The lease ran its full course that winter and into the spring, and somewhere in the slow accumulation of repaired fence and mended barn roof and letters that had stopped being about creek levels and started being about everything else, Everett Cole rode out to the Mercer homestead one evening in early April and found Clara in her garden, kneeling in the new soil, planting rows as straight as the ones that had first stopped him at her fence line months before. "The lease is up next month," he said. "I know," Clara said, not looking up from the soil. "I've been doing the math on what comes after." "So have I," Everett said. He crouched beside her at the edge of the garden bed, close but not crowding. The way he had learned, somewhere in the months between them, was the only way she ever let anyone close. "I'm not offering to buy your land, Clara. I never was going to. I know that too," she said. "I'm asking something else." He turned a small stone over in his fingers, the kind of nervous gesture a powerful man rarely allows himself in front of anyone. "I'd like this to be a partnership, real one. Not me providing and you accepting. Equal standing, on paper and otherwise." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him fully for the first time since he'd crouched down beside her. "My terms," she said. "Your terms," he agreed. She laid them out plainly, the way she laid out everything, having clearly already thought them through long before he'd arrived to ask. Her deed stayed separate, in her name alone, regardless of whatever else got combined between their operations. The water records for her parcel stayed hers to keep, since she'd kept them faithfully for 5 years, and saw no reason to hand that history to anyone else now that it finally mattered to someone. And she wanted real say in how the combined operation ran, not a courtesy seat at a table where decisions had already been made before she sat down. "Done," Everett said, without a pause long enough to suggest he'd needed to think about any of it. "You're not even going to negotiate one of them?" Clara asked, an echo of the question she'd asked him months earlier at the fence line. "I told you once," Everett said. "I don't negotiate good water, or a good neighbor. Turns out, I don't negotiate you either." They were married that June, a small gathering at the homestead, the swept yard finally crowded with more people than it had seen in years. The combined operation took a new name that month, painted onto a fresh sign at the property line where the two ranges met, the Cole-Mercer Range, the name itself a small, deliberate insistence that this had never been one person rescuing another, but two people choosing to stand on the same ground. Inside the house, in the front room where Everett had first found her asleep, with a ledger across her lap, the old deed still hung exactly where her father had first placed it, exactly where Clara had insisted it stay, framed plainly, positioned so she would see it first thing every morning when she opened her eyes. Not as a relic of what she'd almost lost, as a reminder of what she had never actually let go of, not once, not even on the hardest mornings, not even when the whole county had quietly decided she was finished. Wealth, it turns out, isn't always about what a man can afford to buy. Sometimes it's about what he chooses not to. Everett Cole had the money to take that homestead the day he first saw it, the way wealthy men had taken dozens of homesteads just like it across that territory, quietly, legally, and with no one left standing close enough to call it what it was. What he did instead was smaller and far harder to do. He looked at a woman who refused to be finished, and rather than offering to save her, he simply agreed that she had never needed saving in the first place. He brought resources, he brought protection, but he never once tried to carry what was rightfully hers to carry herself. Have you ever seen someone choose respect when they could have chosen power instead? I'd love to hear about it, Thank you for riding with me today. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding.